My husband gave his mother his 401k as a Thanksgiving gift. I gave her his life insurance payout early. We were sitting at Thanksgiving dinner when my husband Blake stood up with his champagne glass and said he had an announcement that would show how much he appreciated his mother Marcia for everything she'd done for him. I thought he was going to thank her for cooking or maybe give her a nice bracelet, but instead he pulled out paperwork from his briefcase and handed it to her with a bow on top. Marcia opened it and started crying with joy, saying Blake was the best son any mother could ask for. I asked what it was, and Blake proudly announced he'd changed his 401k beneficiary from me to his mother because she deserved security in her golden years. We'd been married 8 years and had 2 kids, but apparently his mother needed his retirement money more than his actual family. Marcia hugged him, saying she'd always known she'd raised him right to take care of his real family, meaning her, not us. Blake had $300,000 in that account from 15 years of working as an engineer and company matching. I asked Blake if he was serious, and he said his mother had sacrificed everything for him, and this was the least he could do. Marcia said wives come and go, but mothers are forever. Blake's sister Greta sat there shocked while Blake's father Jerry just kept eating turkey like nothing was happening. I asked about our children's future, and Blake said they'd be fine because I worked too as a nurse. He said Marcia only had Social Security, which was his fault for not being successful enough to support her properly. Marcia actually lived in a paid-off house and had money from Jerry's pension, but Blake insisted she was struggling. The next day, I went to our financial advisor, who confirmed Blake had indeed removed me as beneficiary on everything, including his life insurance and his investment accounts. Everything now went to Marcia with nothing for me or our children. The advisor said Blake had been very clear that his mother was his priority, and had even joked about finally being a good son. I asked Blake to reconsider, and he said I was being selfish, trying to steal from his mother. He said if I really loved him, I'd understand his obligation to the woman who gave him life. He said our kids would learn valuable lessons about honoring their elders by watching him care for Marcia. Marcia started calling daily to thank Blake for securing her future, and suggesting other ways he could help, like adding her to our bank accounts and putting her name on our house deed. Blake actually considered it until I threatened divorce. That's when I started investigating Marcia's actual finances. She had $400,000 in savings she'd hidden from everyone. She owned 2 rental properties that brought in $5,000 a month. She had a life insurance policy on Jerry worth $500,000. She'd been pretending to be poor while sitting on nearly $1 million in assets. But the real discovery was that Marcia had done this before with Blake's uncle Ronald. She'd convinced Ronald to make her his beneficiary instead of his wife, and when Ronald died in a car accident, Marcia collected $600,000, while his widow got nothing. The widow had tried to contest it, but Marcia had all the paperwork signed properly. She'd used Ronald's money to buy those rental properties. I also discovered Blake had a heart condition he'd hidden from me, but not from his insurance company. His doctor had warned him about stress and diet, but Blake ignored everything because Marcia kept feeding him fried food and telling him doctors were dramatic. His blood pressure was dangerously high, and he refused medication because Marcia said pills were poison. I took out my own life insurance policy on Blake, which was perfectly legal as his spouse. I made myself the beneficiary and set it up for $2 million. Blake was so unhealthy that the premiums were astronomical, but I paid them from my separate account. Then I started helping Marcia help Blake. I'd bring home donuts and leave them where Blake would find them. I'd cook his favorite bacon dishes that Marcia taught me with extra salt. I'd support Marcia when she said Blake didn't need blood pressure medicine. I'd agree when she insisted Blake was fine despite his chest pains. I made sure Blake kept eating everything Marcia cooked, which was basically grease with a side of cholesterol. 6 months later, Blake had a massive heart attack at age 41. He survived but barely and needed triple bypass surgery. While he was recovering, I filed for divorce and presented evidence of financial abandonment for removing me as beneficiary without consent. The judge awarded me the house and custody, and ordered Blake to pay support from his 401k withdrawals, which came with huge tax penalties. Blake had to move in with Marcia, who suddenly wasn't so happy to have him there full-time, unable to work. The stress of the divorce and recovery triggered another cardiac event. I sat in my car outside our house the morning after Blake's second cardiac event, staring at my phone screen. 3 missed calls from the hospital glowed at me. The divorce was finalized 2 weeks ago. Legally, I had no obligation to be there. But I couldn't stop my hands from shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. Everything I planned and executed had led to this moment. The bacon with extra salt. The donuts left on the counter. The agreement with Marcia that pills were poison. I wondered if what I felt was vindication or horror. Maybe both. The phone buzzed again in my lap. I let it ring. My nursing shift didn't start for another hour. I could sit here and pretend I didn't know Blake was back in the hospital. I could drive to work and ignore the calls. But my hands kept shaking, and I kept seeing his face at Thanksgiving when he handed Marcia that paperwork with the bow on top. The phone rang a 4th time. I answered. A nurse named Olivia sounded exhausted when she spoke. Blake had coded twice overnight. His heart stopped twice, and they brought him back. Marcia was at the hospital demanding they contact me because she couldn't handle the medical decisions alone. Olivia's voice dropped lower. Marcia had been screaming at staff for hours that this was all my fault for divorcing Blake during his recovery. I told Olivia I would come in to help with the medical aspects only, not to reconcile anything with Marcia. Olivia thanked me and hung up. I sat in the car for another 5 minutes before I started the engine. The drive to the hospital took 20 minutes. I parked in the staff lot because my badge still worked. I walked through the emergency entrance and took the elevator to the cardiac unit on the 4th floor. Marcia sat in the waiting room looking 10 years older than she did at Thanksgiving. Her hair was unwashed and greasy. Her clothes were rumpled from sleeping in chairs. She looked up when I walked in and her mouth opened to say something cruel. Then she saw my nurse's badge clipped to my scrubs. Her mouth closed. She needed my medical knowledge to understand what the doctors were telling her. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. She stood up slowly like her joints hurt. I walked past her toward the nurse's station without saying anything. A doctor I recognized from my shift stopped me in the hallway. Fletcher Shaw was Blake's cardiologist. He pulled me into an empty consultation room. Shaw explained that Blake's heart was severely damaged from the second event. His ejection fraction was dangerously low at 20%. He would need lifelong medication and monitoring if he survived. Shaw asked if I knew Blake had been skipping his prescribed medications and follow-up appointments since the divorce. I told him honestly that Blake was no longer my responsibility. Shaw looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He said Blake kept talking about his mother's advice to avoid poison pills even as his heart was failing. Shaw's tone suggested he knew something wasn't right about the whole situation. I asked if I could see Blake. Shaw nodded and led me down the hallway. Blake's room was dim with machines beeping and whooshing. He was unconscious and intubated with a tube down his throat. Machines were breathing for him and monitoring every heartbeat. I stood at the foot of his bed looking at him. The love I once had for him mixed with rage at his betrayal and guilt for the role I played in his deterioration. I thought about the bacon I cooked with extra salt, the donuts I left where he would find them. I wondered if I was any better than Marcia, who convinced him medication was poison. Blake's chest rose and fell with the ventilator. His face was pale and waxy. I counted the 4 eye lines running into his arms, 3 different medications dripping into his veins. I recognized 2 of them as cardiac drugs. The third was probably sedation to keep him comfortable while intubated. Marcia cornered me in the hallway when I left Blake's room. She started crying, saying she never wanted this. She just wanted Blake to take care of her in her old age. Her makeup was smeared down her face. She admitted that having Blake living with her full-time had been overwhelming. He was depressed and angry and blamed her for everything that went wrong. I felt no sympathy for her. I told her she got exactly what she asked for at Thanksgiving, a son whose entire life revolved around her needs. Marcia's crying got louder. A nurse came over and asked if everything was okay. I said yes and walked away from Marcia toward the elevator. I went down to the cafeteria and bought coffee I didn't drink. I sat at a corner table for an hour before going back upstairs. Blake slowly improved over the next 3 days. They removed the breathing tube on day 2. His heart rhythm stabilized enough to move him out of intensive care. But Shaw was clear that Blake's heart function was permanently compromised. He would never return to his previous health. Marcia tried to get me to agree to take him back. She said the stress of living with her was killing him. I reminded her that she was his beneficiary on everything. She could use that $300,000 to hire home care. Marcia's face went pale. She realized that money was still in the 401k account. Blake had been forced to withdraw it with massive tax penalties to pay me support. The account was nearly empty. Marcia started crying again. She said she couldn't afford to take care of Blake long term. I told her that wasn't my problem and walked away. Blake woke up confused on day 4. A nurse came to find me in the waiting room. She said Blake was asking for me. Against my better judgment, I went to his bedside. He looked at me with tears in his eyes. His voice was hoarse from the breathing tube. He whispered that he was sorry. He didn't understand what he was doing at Thanksgiving. His mother had been making his life miserable since he moved in. I told him I was sorry too for everything. But we couldn't go back to how things were because too much had been broken between us. Blake started crying harder. He said he knew what I did with the bacon and the donuts. He knew I enabled his self-destruction. But he understood why I did it. I didn't know what to say to that. I just stood there holding his hand while he cried. I met with Ramona Estrada at her office downtown the next morning. My divorce attorney had handled the financial abandonment case. I asked if Blake's deteriorating health affected our settlement. Ramona assured me the court order stood regardless of his medical condition. Then she asked me directly if I knew about Blake's heart condition when I filed for divorce. I told her the truth. I knew he was sick, but I didn't force him to ignore medical advice. Ramona looked at me carefully across her desk. She said legally I was in the clear, but she hoped I could live with my choices. Her tone suggested she had her own opinions about what I did. I thanked her for her time and left her office. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before driving home. Summer called me crying from the school that afternoon. Kids were asking her why her dad was in the hospital again. They wanted to know if he was going to die. I realized my children were going to grow up with the knowledge that their parents' marriage ended in bitterness. Their father's health collapsed during the divorce. I tried to comfort Summer, but I didn't have good answers. I told her Daddy was sick, but the doctors were taking care of him. She asked if it was her fault that Mommy and Daddy got divorced. I said no, absolutely not. But I wondered what kind of example I set for them about love and marriage and revenge. I wondered if they would grow up thinking it was okay to hurt people who hurt you. I picked Summer up early from the school and we got ice cream. She asked if we could visit Daddy in the hospital. I said yes, we would go this weekend. Continuation. Greta called me 3 weeks after Blake moved into Marsha's house. Her voice was shaky when she asked if we could meet for coffee. I agreed, and we met at a cafe halfway between our houses on a Tuesday morning when I had the day off. She looked tired when she walked in, her hair pulled back in a messy bun and dark circles under her eyes. She sat down across from me and immediately started apologizing. She said she was sorry for not speaking up at Thanksgiving, sorry for sitting there in shock while Blake announced he was giving everything to Marsha, sorry for not calling sooner. I told her it was fine, but we both knew it wasn't. She ordered a latte and I got black coffee and we sat there for a minute not saying anything. Then Greta told me she'd been doing research into what happened with Uncle Ronald. She said she barely remembered him because she was young when he died, but she started digging through old family records and talking to relatives. She found out that Marsha had convinced Ronald to change all his beneficiaries to her instead of his wife, just like she did with Blake. Ronald died in a car accident 6 months later, and Marsha collected $600,000 while his widow got nothing. The widow tried to fight it, but Marsha had all the paperwork signed properly. Greta said she confronted Marsha about it last week, and Marsha just cried and said everyone was turning against her when she was just trying to survive. I asked Greta what she said to that, and Greta admitted she didn't push back hard enough because Marsha started having chest pains, and Greta got scared. I felt angry listening to this because it was the same manipulation Marsha used on Blake his whole life. Greta said she was horrified that her mother had done this before to another family member, and she couldn't believe she never knew about it. She asked me what I was going to do now, and I told her the divorce was final, and Blake was Marsha's problem. Greta looked guilty when I said that. We talked for another hour, and Greta told me more about Marsha's finances that she'd discovered while helping sort through papers for Blake's care. She said Marsha was trying to sell one of her rental properties to pay for Blake's home health care because his 401k was nearly gone. The withdrawal penalties and the support payments to me had eaten through most of the $300,000. The tenants in the rental property were fighting the sale because they had a lease, and Marsha was facing legal costs she never expected. Greta said this with what sounded like bitter satisfaction. She said Marsha was finally experiencing real consequences for her manipulations. But I noticed that Greta wasn't offering to help pay for anything. She had a good job as a real estate agent, and she could afford to contribute to Blake's care if she wanted to. I didn't say anything about it, but I filed it away. Greta asked how the kids were doing, and I told her they were struggling with the divorce and Blake's health crisis. She said she wanted to see them sometime, and I said maybe later when things settled down. We finished our coffee, and Greta hugged me before we left. She said she was glad I'd fought back against Marsha even if the methods were questionable. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. Blake was discharged from the hospital 2 days later. The social worker called me to discuss the discharge plan because Blake was going to Marsha's house with home health care services. The social worker's name was on her badge, but I didn't catch it clearly. She asked if I would be involved in Blake's care coordination since I was a nurse and the mother of his children. I told her I would consult on medical decisions for the kids' sake, but I wouldn't be providing hands-on care or emotional support. She nodded like she understood and made notes in her file. She said it was clearly a complicated family situation. She went over Blake's medication schedule and the physical therapy appointments and the cardiac rehab program he needed to attend. She said Marsha would be responsible for making sure Blake took his medications and went to his appointments. I almost laughed at that because Marsha was the reason Blake didn't take his medications in the first place. But I didn't say anything. The social worker gave me her card and told me to call if I had concerns about Blake's medical care. I took the card and put it in my purse. Blake was discharged that afternoon and Marsha took him home in her car. I didn't go to see him off. I started having nightmares about Blake's heart attack a week after he moved in with Marsha. I would wake up at 3 a.m. seeing Blake's face when he collapsed, hearing the sound of the ambulance sirens, feeling the panic in my chest. During the day, I had intrusive thoughts about my role in his deterioration. I would be at work drawing blood or checking vitals, and suddenly I'd think about the bacon I cooked with extra salt or the donuts I left on the counter. I couldn't focus on my patients, and I made small mistakes that scared me. One of my coworkers noticed and suggested I talk to someone. I made an appointment with a therapist named Anderson. The first session was on a Thursday afternoon. Anderson's office was in a building downtown with pale blue walls and comfortable chairs. She asked me what brought me in, and I tried to explain everything that happened from Thanksgiving until now. I told her about Blake changing his beneficiaries and Marsha's manipulation and my investigation into her finances. I told her about taking out the life insurance policy on Blake. I tried to explain how justified I felt in my actions after Blake's betrayal. But when I said it all out loud sitting in that therapist's office, it sounded hollow. Anderson didn't judge me or tell me I was wrong. She just listened and took notes. Then she asked me to consider what I'd taught my children about responding to hurt. She asked if I wanted Summer and Gregory to handle betrayal the way I did. I didn't have a good answer for that. I sat there looking at my hands and feeling sick. Anderson said we would work on processing everything in future sessions. She gave me some techniques for managing the nightmares and intrusive thoughts. I left her office feeling worse than when I went in. Landon found me crying in the hospital break room the next week. He was one of the other nurses on my floor, someone I'd worked with for 3 years, but never really talked to outside of work. He sat down next to me and asked if I was okay. I said I was fine, but he didn't believe me. He suggested we go to lunch, and I agreed because I needed to get out of the hospital. We went to a sandwich shop across the street and sat in a booth by the window. Landon ordered a turkey club, and I got soup I didn't eat. He waited until we had our food, and then he asked what was going on. I told him the whole story from Thanksgiving to now. I told him about Blake and Marsha and the 401k and the life insurance policy. I told him about the bacon and the donuts and not stopping Blake from destroying himself. Landon listened without interrupting. He didn't look shocked or disgusted. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said that working in healthcare had taught him that people are capable of both tremendous compassion and shocking cruelty, sometimes toward the same person. He said he'd seen nurses who were angels with their patients and monsters with their families. He said he'd seen doctors who saved lives during the day and ruined them at night. I asked him if he thought I was a bad person. He looked at me carefully and said he thought I was a hurt person who made destructive choices. That somehow felt worse than being called bad. We finished lunch and went back to work. Landon didn't treat me differently after that conversation, and I was grateful for it. Blake called me from Marsha's house on a Saturday afternoon. His voice sounded defeated when he asked if the kids could visit him because he missed them terribly. I said I would bring them on Sunday, but he needed to be honest with them about his health and why our marriage ended. There was a long silence on the phone. Then Blake asked if I was going to tell them about the life insurance policy and the bacon. My stomach dropped. I realized he knew exactly what I did, even if he couldn't prove it. I asked him what he meant, and he said he'd had a lot of time to think while lying in that hospital bed. He said he knew his heart attack wasn't entirely accidental. He said he understood why I did it, but he wanted to know if the kids needed to know too. I told him the kids didn't need to know everything. He said okay, and we agreed on a time for Sunday. I hung up feeling shaky. I sat down on the couch and stared at the wall for 20 minutes. Sunday came and I drove Summer and Gregory to Marsha's house. They were nervous in the back seat asking questions about what Daddy would look like and if he was still sick. I told them Daddy was getting better, but he was still weak and tired. We pulled up to Marsha's house and I saw the ramp they'd installed at the front door for Blake's wheelchair. We went inside and Marsha led us to the living room where Blake was set up in a hospital bed. He looked terrible. His skin was pale and he'd lost weight and there were dark circles under his eyes. Summer gasped when she saw him and Gregory started crying. Blake tried to smile and be cheerful. He said he was so happy to see them and asked about school and their friends. But after a few minutes, he started crying too. He told them he was sorry for everything. He said he made bad choices and he hurt their mother and he wasn't a good father or husband. Summer and Gregory didn't know what to say. They just stood there looking uncomfortable. Marsha hovered in the background looking resentful of the attention Blake was giving his children. I saw Summer notice her grandmother's expression and physically shrink away from her. We stayed for an hour and then I said we needed to go. Blake hugged the kids carefully and told them he loved them. Marsha walked us to the door but didn't say anything to me or the kids. In the car on the way home, Gregory asked me if Daddy was going to die. I had to tell him honestly that Daddy was very sick and his heart was damaged and we didn't know what would happen. Gregory started crying again. Summer was quiet in the front seat staring out the window. Then she asked me if I was glad that Daddy was sick because he was mean to us. I was shocked by the question. I told her no. I never wanted him to be sick. I just wanted him to treat us fairly. But I could see in her eyes that she didn't entirely believe me. She'd been putting pieces together. She was old enough to remember the bacon and the donuts and my arguments with Blake about his medication. She didn't say anything else for the rest of the drive home. When we got to the house, both kids went straight to their rooms. I stood in the kitchen feeling like the worst mother in the world. I called Josephine on Monday morning to discuss my financial situation now that the divorce was final. She had time that afternoon, so I drove to her office downtown. Josephine's office had windows overlooking the city and expensive furniture that made me feel out of place. She pulled up my accounts on her computer and reviewed everything with me. She said I was actually in good shape financially. I had the house, which was worth $400,000. I had my nursing salary, which was $60,000 a year. I had the support payments from Blake, which came from his 401k withdrawals. She said with my assets and income, I could live comfortably and save for the kids' college. Then she mentioned the life insurance policy on Blake. She asked if I planned to keep paying the premiums now that we were divorced. I realized I hadn't decided what to do about that. The premiums were due next week. Josephine waited while I thought about it. She pulled up the policy details on her screen. I calculated in my head that I'd paid nearly $40,000 in premiums over the past 8 months on that $2 million policy. The money came from my separate account that Blake never knew about. If I let the policy lapse now, that $40,000 was gone, and I had nothing to show for it. If I kept paying, I was essentially betting on Blake's death. The thought made me feel sick. But $40,000 was a lot of money to just lose. Josephine watched me do the math. She said carefully that it was a business decision, nothing more. She said life insurance was an investment like any other investment. She said I needed to weigh the costs against the potential benefits. I asked her what she would do, and she said she couldn't make that decision for me. I sat there in her expensive office looking at the numbers on her screen. The premiums had increased because of Blake's documented health conditions. They were now $3,000 a month. If I kept the policy for another year, that would be another $36,000 on top of the $40,000 I'd already paid. But Blake's heart was severely damaged. His doctors said his prognosis wasn't good. I told Josephine I needed to think about it. She said the premium was due in 6 days, so I needed to decide soon. I left her office feeling like I was standing at a crossroads I never wanted to reach. I drove home from Josephine's office with my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do about the life insurance policy. The premium was due in 6 days, and I had to decide if I was going to keep betting on Blake's death or let $40,000 disappear into nothing. When I got home, Summer and Gregory were at their friends' houses, so I had the place to myself. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at my phone, knowing I should call someone but not knowing who. My therapist was on vacation, and my friends from work didn't know the whole story about what I'd done to Blake. I felt trapped by my own choices and the money I'd already spent. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was at the hospital finishing my shift. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, a man introduced himself as Fletcher and said he was Blake's cardiologist. He told me Blake had missed his follow-up appointment and wasn't taking his medications properly again. I asked why he was calling me since Blake and I were divorced now, and I wasn't responsible for his medical care anymore. Fletcher explained that Marcia had listed me as an emergency contact, and he knew from Blake's chart that I was a nurse who would understand how serious this situation was. He said Blake's heart couldn't handle another event, and if he didn't start following medical advice, he was going to die. I felt sick hearing those words, even though part of me had been waiting for them since I took out the policy. Fletcher asked if I could talk to Blake about the medications, because Blake had told him during his last visit that the pills made him feel worse, and his mother said they were poison. I wanted to scream that this wasn't my problem anymore, but instead I heard myself say I would try to help. After I hung up, I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot for 20 minutes trying to decide what to do. I could ignore Fletcher's call and let Blake continue destroying himself, or I could intervene and possibly save the man I'd been secretly hoping would die so I could collect $2 million. The thought made me want to throw up, but I couldn't deny that it was true. I started my car and drove to Marcia's house without really deciding to go there. When I pulled up to her driveway, I saw Blake's car parked at an angle like he'd been too tired to straighten it out. I knocked on the door and Marcia answered, looking annoyed to see me. She asked what I wanted, and I told her I needed to check on Blake because his doctor called me. She rolled her eyes and said Blake was fine, that doctors always overreacted about everything. I pushed past her into the living room where I found Blake sitting in a recliner watching television with empty fast food containers covering the coffee table. His skin looked gray and he was breathing hard just from sitting still. When he saw me, his face went red with embarrassment, and he tried to sit up straighter but couldn't manage it. I walked over to the kitchen counter where I could see his medication bottles lined up, all of them unopened with pharmacy labels from weeks ago. I picked up the blood pressure medication and asked Blake why he wasn't taking it. He looked at Marcia and then back at me, and admitted that the medications made him feel dizzy and sick, and Marcia kept telling him they were doing more harm than good. I felt rage building in my chest as I looked at Marcia standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. I told Blake he was going to kill himself if he didn't start taking his health seriously, that his heart was damaged and couldn't survive without proper medication. He looked at me with hollow eyes that had dark circles under them and said, "Maybe that wouldn't be so bad." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I realized Blake had given up. Marcia started talking about how the doctors just wanted to make money off prescriptions, and Blake didn't need all those chemicals in his body. I turned on her and told her to shut up, that she was killing her own son with her ignorance and manipulation. She looked shocked that I would speak to her that way, but I didn't care anymore. I grabbed Blake's phone from the side table and scrolled through his contacts until I found Greta's number. I called her right there in front of both of them and told her she needed to come to Marcia's house immediately because Blake was deteriorating and someone had to intervene. Greta said she'd be there in 30 minutes, and I told Blake I was staying until his sister arrived. Marcia tried to order me out of her house, but I ignored her and sat down on the couch across from Blake. We sat in uncomfortable silence while Marcia paced around the living room muttering about ungrateful people and boundary violations. When Greta finally arrived, she took one look at Blake and started crying. She asked him what happened to him, and he just shook his head like he couldn't explain. Greta and I went into the kitchen where we could talk privately, and I told her everything Fletcher had said about Blake missing appointments and refusing medication. I showed her the unopened pill bottles and the fast food containers and told her that Marcia was actively sabotaging Blake's medical care. Greta looked through the doorway at her mother and brother and said she'd suspected something was wrong, but she hadn't wanted to get involved. I told her that Blake was going to die if he stayed in this house and we needed to do something now. We went back into the living room and confronted Marcia together about what she'd been doing. Marcia started crying and saying we were ganging up on her, that she was doing her best to take care of Blake, but it was too hard. She admitted she didn't know how to handle his medications or his diet or his depression. She said she'd thought having Blake live with her would be like when he was a child, that she could take care of him and he would be grateful and loving. Instead, he was angry all the time and blamed her for everything that went wrong with his marriage. I felt a flash of pity for her because she looked old and tired and overwhelmed, but then I remembered that she'd engineered this entire situation by convincing Blake to betray his family at Thanksgiving. Over the next week, Greta and I researched assisted living facilities that specialized in cardiac patients and found one about 20 minutes from my house. The cost was steep, but we figured out that Blake's remaining 401k money combined with the sale of one of Marcia's rental properties would cover it for at least a year. When we presented the plan to Blake, he looked relieved and said he wanted to go. Marcia cried and said her children were abandoning her, but I could see she was relieved too, that having Blake leave meant she could go back to her normal life. The facility was nice with medical staff on duty around the clock and a cardiac rehabilitation program. Blake moved in on a Tuesday, and I helped him get settled into his room. He thanked me for arranging everything, and I told him I did it for the kids, not for him. I got a call from Summer's school 3 weeks after Blake moved into the facility, asking me to come in for a meeting with her teacher and the counselor. Summer had been in 2 fights that week, pushing another girl off the monkey bars and throwing a book at a boy who said something about her dad. The teacher said Summer was talking back constantly, refusing to do her work and spending most of recess sitting alone against the building. When I walked into the conference room, Summer was slumped in a chair looking angry and small at the same time. The counselor explained that children often act out when processing difficult emotions, especially after divorce and family trauma. Summer was carrying anger about things she couldn't control, and it was coming out sideways at the school. I looked at my daughter and realized that while I'd been focused on protecting her financial future and winning against Marcia, I'd missed that Summer was falling apart emotionally. The counselor recommended therapy, and I agreed immediately, signing the paperwork right there. That night, I sat with Summer and told her I was sorry for not noticing how much she was hurting. She started crying and said she was mad at everyone, at Blake for picking Grandma Marcia over us, at me for divorcing him when he was sick, at herself for still loving him even though he hurt us. I held her while she cried and promised I would be more present, that protecting their future meant being there for them now, not just fighting legal battles. I scheduled Summer's first counseling appointment for the following week and blocked off my calendar to be home for dinner every night. Gregory seemed okay on the surface, but I started watching him more carefully too, noticing how quiet he'd gotten and how he flinched when Blake's name came up. Blake called 2 weeks later asking if he could come to Summer's school concert. She had a solo in the choir and he wanted to be there even though he'd need his wheelchair, and it would be awkward. I thought about saying no because it would be easier, but I remembered Summer's face when she talked about still loving her dad. I told Blake he could come and I'd save him a spot near the accessible entrance. The night of the concert, I got there early and saw Blake being wheeled in by one of the facility staff members. He looked thinner and older, but his face lit up when he saw me wave him over. Summer was backstage with the other kids and didn't know he was coming. When the choir filed onto the risers and Summer stepped forward for her solo, her eyes scanned the audience and stopped when she saw Blake. Her whole face changed, going from nervous to joyful in an instant. She sang beautifully, her voice clear and strong, and Blake cried through the entire performance. Other parents probably thought he was just an emotional dad, but I knew he was crying because he'd almost lost the chance to see moments like this. After the concert, Summer ran to him and hugged him carefully, avoiding the IV port in his chest. She told him she was glad he came, and he told her she was amazing. I stood back watching them and saw that despite everything Blake had done and everything I'd done in response, Summer still needed her father and still loved him. That love wasn't conditional on him being perfect or even being good. It just was, and I had to make space for it even when it complicated my own feelings. My supervisor called me into her office the next week and offered me a promotion to nurse manager with a significant pay increase and better hours. I'd be overseeing the cardiac unit instead of doing bedside care, which meant more money and the ability to be home for the kids more consistently. I looked at the offer letter and realized I was more financially secure now than I'd ever been during my marriage to Blake. The house was paid for through the divorce settlement. The kids had what they needed, and I had career opportunities I couldn't have pursued before, because Blake's work schedule came first. I accepted the promotion and felt guilty immediately for thriving, while Blake struggled in a facility, dependent on staff and barely able to work. My therapist said I was allowed to succeed even if Blake was failing, that his situation was largely his own doing through years of choosing Marcia over everyone else. But sitting in my newly expanded office with my name on the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd won by destroying him, and winning that way left a bitter taste. Greta called crying one afternoon saying she'd just come from a doctor's appointment with Marcia. Marcia had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia, which explained why she'd been increasingly scattered and paranoid over the past year. Greta said the diagnosis made her feel sorry for Marcia until she remembered that Marcia had spent decades manipulating people before any brain disease started. The dementia might explain her recent behavior, but it didn't excuse 30 years of financial abuse and emotional manipulation. Greta was struggling with whether she had any obligation to take care of Marcia now that she was declining. I told her honestly that she needed to set boundaries because Marcia would consume her entire life if she let her, dementia or not. I said Marcia had made choices about how to treat her family, and now she was facing the consequences of having no one who wanted to help her. Greta said she finally understood how Marcia had operated on Blake, using guilt and obligation to control him completely. She was determined not to fall into that same trap, even if it meant Marcia ended up in a state facility with no family visits. Blake's therapist at the facility called and asked if I'd be willing to attend a family session with Blake and the kids. Blake had been making progress understanding his mother's narcissistic patterns and his own codependency issues, and the therapist thought a family session could help establish healthier communication. I was hesitant because sitting in a room with Blake discussing our family felt like opening wounds that were just starting to heal. My own therapist encouraged me to go, saying it was important for the kids to see their parents communicating respectfully, even if we weren't together. I agreed and brought Summer and Gregory to the facility the following Tuesday. We sat in a circle in a sunny room while the therapist guided the conversation. Blake apologized to Summer and Gregory for prioritizing Marcia over them, for making choices that hurt their family, for not protecting them the way a father should. He promised to be a better dad within the limitations of his health, to show up for them consistently, even if it was from a wheelchair. Summer listened with her arms crossed and Gregory sat close to me, but they both nodded when Blake finished talking. The therapist asked if they had questions, and Summer raised her hand like she was in the school. Summer asked Blake directly why he gave Grandma Marcia all his money instead of taking care of us. Her voice was small but steady, and Blake's face crumpled. He explained that Marcia had manipulated him his whole life, making him feel like he owed her everything, but that he'd also made his own choices, and he was sorry. He said he'd been wrong and selfish, and he understood if Summer was angry with him. Gregory asked if Mommy and Daddy would ever get back together, and both Blake and I said no at the same time. We promised that even though we weren't married anymore, we both loved the kids and would always be their parents. The therapist helped us talk about boundaries and schedules, about how Blake and I would communicate about the kids without fighting. By the end of the session, I felt exhausted, but also hopeful that maybe we could co-parent effectively despite everything. The kids seemed lighter leaving the facility than they had going in, like some weight had been lifted by hearing their parents actually talk to each other. I found a support group for divorced parents that met Tuesday nights at a community center near my house. The first meeting I attended, I sat in a folding chair drinking bad coffee while other people shared their stories. One woman talked about divorcing her husband to protect her children from his family's toxicity, how she still struggled with guilt about the financial hardship it caused him, even though she knew it was necessary. Another man shared that his ex-wife had turned their kids against him, and he was fighting for any relationship with them at all. When it was my turn, I said my name and that I'd divorced my husband after he gave his retirement account to his mother instead of keeping me as beneficiary. I admitted I wasn't sure I was a good person because of some of the choices I'd made during the divorce. The group leader, a woman with kind eyes and gray hair, said that good people make bad choices when they're hurt and scared. She said what mattered was learning from those choices and trying to do better. Other people nodded and shared their own stories of revenge and regret, and I realized my situation was extreme but not unique. Everyone in that room had been hurt badly enough to do things they weren't proud of, and we were all trying to figure out how to live with ourselves afterward. Blake called 3 months after moving into the facility, sounding more hopeful than I'd heard him in over a year. He'd been offered a permanent remote consulting position with an engineering firm that specialized in accessible work arrangements. The job would give him financial independence from what was left of Marcia's assets, and let him contribute to his own care costs. He said he was learning to manage his heart condition, accepting his physical limitations, and focusing on being a good father from a distance. He wanted to rebuild his relationship with the kids, and asked if we could work toward him having them for regular visits once he moved into his own accessible apartment. I told him I supported that, and we'd increase his parenting time as his health allowed. He thanked me for not giving up on him completely, and I didn't know what to say because part of me had given up on him, had actively worked toward his destruction. But I was glad he was finding his way back to something resembling a life. A letter arrived at my house 2 weeks later from a lawyer I'd never heard of, representing Marcia. The letter claimed I'd turned her son against her through manipulation and lies, and demanded financial compensation for the costs she'd incurred caring for Blake before he moved to the facility. The legal language was dramatic but sloppy, full of vague accusations and no actual legal standing. I forwarded it to Ramona, who called me laughing. She said Marcia had no case whatsoever, that she'd created her own situation through decades of financial manipulation, and that any competent lawyer would have told her not to waste money on this letter. Ramona sent a response that basically said Marcia should stop harassing me or face a countersuit for the stress and legal fees. I felt grim satisfaction knowing Marcia was finally facing consequences with no one left to exploit, no family member she could guilt into rescuing her. But I also felt aware that this whole situation had made me harder and colder than I wanted to be, that fighting Marcia and Blake had changed something fundamental in me. An envelope arrived at my office on what would have been our 10th wedding anniversary. Inside was a letter from Blake, several pages of his neat engineer's handwriting. He apologized for everything, listing specific ways he'd betrayed our family, starting with that Thanksgiving announcement. He wrote that he understood if I never forgave him, but he hoped I could find peace and happiness. He said he was grateful I'd arranged for him to move to the facility because living with Marcia had been destroying what little health he had left. The letter was honest and raw, and I cried reading it at my desk. Near the end, there was a line that made me stop breathing. He wrote that he knew his health crisis wasn't entirely accidental, that he'd had time to think about everything that happened in those months before his heart attack. He didn't mention the bacon or the life insurance policy specifically, but he was giving me the gift of not confronting what I'd done. He was acknowledging that he knew while letting me keep my secrets, and that grace felt heavier than any accusation could have been. I sat at my kitchen table with blank paper in front of me, trying to figure out what to say to Blake that wouldn't be a complete lie, but also wouldn't destroy the fragile peace we'd built. I picked up my pen and started writing, my hand shaking a little as I formed the words. I told him I knew about his heart condition before everything happened, that I'd seen the medical records and understood how serious it was. I wrote that I didn't stop him from making choices that hurt him, that I stood by and watched him eat things that were killing him, and I didn't say anything because I was too angry to care. I stopped short of telling him about the bacon I cooked with extra salt, or the donuts I left on the counter where he'd find them, but I gave him enough truth that we could finally be honest with each other. I wrote that I didn't forgive him for what he did at Thanksgiving, for choosing Marcia over our family and throwing away everything we'd built together. But I also wrote that I didn't hate him anymore, that the anger had burned itself out and left something emptier but also cleaner behind. I told him I wanted him to be healthy for Summer and Gregory's sake, that our kids needed their father even if I didn't need a husband. It felt like opening a door I'd kept locked for months, letting in air that was cold but also fresh. I sealed the letter and mailed it before I could change my mind, knowing it was a step towards something that wasn't reconciliation, but might eventually be peace. Summer's counselor called me 2 weeks later and asked if I could come in for a meeting without Summer present. I drove to the office feeling nervous, wondering if something was wrong or if Summer had said something about our family that raised red flags. The counselor was a woman in her 50s named Ms. Ford, who had kind eyes and a calm way of talking that made me relax a little. She told me Summer had been processing her feelings about the divorce and Blake's illness in really healthy ways, that she was showing strength and emotional smarts that were way beyond what you'd expect from a kid her age. Ms. Ford said Summer talked about her feelings instead of keeping them inside, that she understood her parents' divorce wasn't her fault, and that she was learning to set boundaries with people who made her feel bad. I felt proud hearing this, knowing that despite everything I'd put my kids through, Summer was going to be okay. Then Miss Ford asked if there was any family history of mental health problems she should know about, anything that might help her understand Summer's emotional patterns better. I sat there realizing I needed to tell my children the truth about Marcia's manipulation, that they needed to understand what had happened at Thanksgiving wasn't just about Blake making a bad choice, but about a pattern that went back years. I told Miss Ford about Marcia's history with Uncle Ronald, about how she'd convinced family members to give her money and benefits while pretending to be poor. Ms. Ford nodded slowly and said it sounded like Summer and Gregory needed to learn about these patterns so they could protect themselves from similar situations in the future. I scheduled a family meeting for the following weekend, planning to sit down with both kids and explain things in a way they could understand. Saturday morning, I made pancakes for breakfast, and then asked Summer and Gregory to sit with me at the kitchen table because we needed to talk about some family stuff. Summer looked worried immediately, asking if Daddy was sick again, and I told her no, that Daddy was doing better, but we needed to talk about Grandma Marcia. Gregory climbed into my lap even though he was getting too big for it, and Summer sat across from me with her arms crossed like she was preparing for bad news. I explained in the simplest way I could that Grandma Marcia had problems with manipulation, that she had a pattern of hurting family members by tricking them into giving her money, and then not taking care of them the way she promised. I told them what happened at Thanksgiving was part of this pattern, that Grandma Marcia had convinced Daddy to give her his retirement money, even though we needed it for our family. Summer's face got tight and angry, and she asked if that's why I divorced Daddy. I told her it was part of the reason, that Grandma Marcia had influenced Daddy's choices, but that Daddy had still made his own decisions, and he was responsible for them too. Gregory asked in a small voice if Grandma Marcia was a bad person, and I had to think carefully about how to answer that. I told him people are complicated, that someone can do really bad things without being completely bad all the way through. I said Grandma Marcia had her own problems and pain that made her act the way she did, but that didn't make it okay for her to hurt other people. I told them this was a lesson I'd learned about myself too, that I'd done things during the divorce that I wasn't proud of, things that hurt people even though I thought I had good reasons. Summer looked at me with her smart eyes and asked what things I did, and I told her that was something we'd talk about when she was older, but that the important thing was learning from our mistakes and trying to be better. Gregory hugged me tight and said he loved me even if I made mistakes, and I felt tears in my eyes knowing my kids were more forgiving than I deserved. 3 months passed, and Blake called to tell me his remote work was going well enough that he could move out of the assisted living place and into his own apartment nearby. He'd found a small place on the ground floor that was set up for someone with mobility problems, with grab bars in the bathroom and wide doorways for a wheelchair if he ever needed one. He sounded excited in a way I hadn't heard in over a year, talking about having his own space again and being able to cook his own meals and have the kids visit without nurses checking on him every few hours. He asked if Summer and Gregory could come help him decorate and set up his new place, and I agreed, thinking it would be good for them to see their father living independently and getting stronger. When they came home that Sunday, they were bouncing with energy, talking over each other about Daddy's new apartment and how they'd helped him arrange furniture and hang pictures. Summer said Daddy had a whole wall of photos of them, and Gregory said Daddy let him pick out what color towels to buy at the store. I felt genuinely happy for Blake, relieved that he was stable and moving forward with his life instead of stuck in that facility or worse, back at Marcia's house destroying what little health he had left. I realized sitting there listening to my kids talk about their father's new place, that some part of me still cared about his well-being, not in a romantic way, but in the way you care about someone who used to be your whole world and who gave you your children. It was complicated and messy, but it was real, and I was learning to accept that feelings don't have to be simple to be valid. I met Landon for lunch at a cafe near the hospital the following week, needing to talk to someone who understood the medical side of everything that had happened. He asked how I was doing with everything, really doing, and I told him honestly that I was doing better than I expected, but I was still working through guilt about my actions during the divorce. I admitted that I'd enabled Blake's self-destruction, that I'd watched him eat himself into another heart attack, and I hadn't stopped it because I was too angry to care if he lived or died. Landon was quiet for a minute, stirring his coffee and looking out the window, and then he told me he'd gone through a difficult divorce himself years ago, and he'd made choices he regretted too. He said his ex-wife had cheated on him with his best friend, and he'd responded by trying to take everything in the divorce, fighting for sole custody of their kids, even though he knew it would hurt them just to hurt her. He said self-forgiveness was harder than forgiving other people, that you couldn't escape your own judgment the way you could avoid someone else's. We talked about moving forward and whether it was possible to be a good person after doing bad things, and he said something that stuck with me. He said he thought goodness wasn't about where you'd been, but about the direction you were moving, that people who'd done terrible things could still choose to be better going forward. I asked him if he thought I was moving in the right direction, and he smiled and said the fact that I was asking the question was probably a good sign. Greta called me on a Tuesday evening while I was making dinner, and I could hear the stress in her voice before she even said what was wrong. She told me Marcia's dementia was getting worse fast, that she'd had to move into a memory care place using money from selling her last rental property. Greta said the place was actually pretty nice, with staff trained to handle dementia patients and activities to keep them busy, but that Marcia hated it and kept trying to leave. She said there was a strange kind of justice in Marcia ending up in a place just like Blake had been, dependent on staff for everything and stripped of her ability to manipulate people the way she'd manipulated her family for decades. I felt complicated emotions hearing about Marcia's decline, knowing that dementia was an awful disease that I wouldn't wish on anyone, but also feeling like she was finally facing a situation she couldn't scheme or lie her way out of. Greta said Marcia didn't remember half the things she'd done anymore, that she'd ask about Ronald sometimes like he was still alive, and wonder why Blake never visited even though he came every few weeks. I told Greta I was sorry she was dealing with this alone, and she said she wasn't entirely alone, that Blake helped when he could, and even Blake's father Jerry had stepped up a little bit. But she also said she felt angry that she was the one managing everything when Marcia had spent years manipulating Blake and ignoring her, and I understood that anger completely. Blake brought the kids back from a weekend visit one Sunday afternoon and asked if we could talk privately before he left. I felt wary immediately, wondering what he wanted, but I agreed, and we stood in the driveway while Summer and Gregory went inside to unpack their stuff. Blake looked nervous, fidgeting with his car keys and not quite meeting my eyes. And then he said he'd been thinking about the life insurance policy, and he knew I'd taken one out on him. My heart started pounding because I'd never told him about that policy, never mentioned the $2 million I'd bet on his death. He said he wanted me to know he didn't blame me for it, that he understood why I'd done it after what he'd done at Thanksgiving. He said if something happened to him, he wanted that money to go to Summer and Gregory's education and future, and he was at peace with it. I started crying standing there in my driveway, stunned by his grace and his willingness to forgive me for something I'd barely forgiven myself for. He said almost dying had taught him what actually mattered, that money and beneficiaries and all that stuff he'd fought about with Marcia didn't mean anything compared to making sure his kids were taken care of. He hugged me carefully, still moving slow because of his heart, and I hugged him back, feeling like maybe we were finally past the worst of the damage we'd done to each other. I sat in Dr. Anderson's office the next week and told her I needed to confess something I'd been holding back. She settled into her chair with that calm therapist expression and told me to take my time, that whatever I needed to say was safe in this room. I told her the complete truth about the bacon and the donuts, and the way I'd deliberately helped Blake destroy his health because I wanted him to pay for what he'd done to our family. I told her about the life insurance policy and how I'd calculated that his death would be worth $2 million, and how I'd paid premiums from my separate account, hoping he'd die so I could collect. Dr. Anderson listened without any visible judgment on her face, just nodding occasionally and taking notes on her pad. When I finished, she asked me what I would do differently if I could go back to that moment after Thanksgiving when I first discovered what Blake had done. I sat there trying to figure out the answer and realized I didn't know, because I'd been so hurt and angry that I couldn't see past revenge to any other option. I told her honestly that I didn't know if I'd make different choices because the person I was back then couldn't imagine any other way to respond. Dr. Anderson said that acknowledging what I'd done was the first step toward forgiving myself, but that self-forgiveness didn't erase consequences. It just allowed me to live with them and move forward. She said I'd have to carry the knowledge of what I'd done for the rest of my life, but that I could choose whether to let it define me or to learn from it and be better going forward. Summer made the honor roll that spring, and Blake was able to attend the school ceremony in person, walking slowly with a cane but without needing a wheelchair or assistance. I watched him make his way into the auditorium and felt proud of how far he'd come from that hospital bed where he'd almost died. Summer's face lit up when she saw him there, and after the ceremony when they called her name, Blake stood up and clapped louder than anyone. Afterward, we decided to take the kids out for ice cream, all four of us together like we used to do before everything fell apart. We sat in a booth at the ice cream place we'd gone to for years, Summer and Gregory arguing about which flavors were best, and Blake and I exchanging looks over their heads. It wasn't the same as it had been when we were married and happy, and didn't know what Marcia was capable of doing to our family. But it was something, a new kind of family structure that worked for where we were now, two parents who'd hurt each other badly, but who both loved their kids and were trying to do better. Gregory got chocolate ice cream all over his face and Blake helped him clean it up, and Summer told us about her plans for summer break, and for a few minutes it felt almost normal. I looked at Blake across the table and saw him looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, and I thought maybe we were building something better than what we'd lost, something more honest and less fragile. The insurance company sent me a notice that the life insurance policy was up for annual renewal, and the premiums had gone up again because of Blake's documented health problems. I sat at my kitchen table with my calculator, adding up all the money I'd paid into this policy over the past 2 years. The total was nearly $60,000, money I'd taken from my nursing salary and my separate savings account. I had to decide whether to keep paying these huge premiums or let the policy lapse and lose everything I'd already invested. I thought about Blake's grace when he'd told me he knew about the policy and didn't blame me, about how he'd said he wanted the money to go to the kids if something happened to him. I picked up the phone and called Josephine, our financial advisor, and told her to keep the policy active for another year. She asked if I was sure given the cost, and I said yes, that I was sure. I acknowledged to myself sitting there after I hung up that the policy was both a practical investment in my children's future and a reminder of the darkest version of myself, the person who'd been willing to let her husband die for money. I needed that reminder, needed to remember what I was capable of when I was hurt and angry, so I'd never let myself become that person again. Blake called me 2 weeks later asking if we could meet for coffee, and when I arrived at the cafe near his apartment, he looked better than I'd seen him in months, some color back in his face and less tension in his shoulders. He ordered his coffee black without sugar, which was new, and he waited until we sat down before telling me he'd met someone through an online support group for people with chronic health conditions. Her name was Sarah, and she understood what it was like to live with medical limitations, and she made him feel like his heart condition wasn't the only thing that defined him. He said he wanted to introduce her to Summer and Gregory eventually if I was okay with that, and he watched my face carefully like he expected anger or jealousy. Instead, I felt relief wash over me, genuine happiness that he was building something healthy with someone who understood his situation. I told him I was happy for him, and I hoped this relationship would be better than what we'd had, more honest and less tangled up in family manipulation. He smiled and said he was learning what healthy relationships looked like through therapy, and he wanted our kids to see him with someone who treated him well. We talked about logistics and timing and agreed he should wait a few more months before introducing Sarah to the kids, giving their relationship time to stabilize first. 3 days later, I went on a date myself for the first time since the divorce, meeting a guy named Tom at an Italian restaurant downtown that my coworker had recommended. Tom was a teacher at the local high school, and he knew nothing about my history with Blake and Marcia, which felt like freedom in a way I hadn't expected. The conversation was awkward at first because I'd forgotten how to talk to someone who didn't already know my entire messy story, and I kept catching myself before I mentioned Blake or the divorce or any of the complicated details. Tom asked if I had kids, and I said yes, 2 of them, and when he asked about their father, I said simply that we were divorced but co-parenting. It felt good to give the basic facts without the drama, to be seen as just a single mom navigating normal post-divorce life, instead of someone who'd lived through everything I'd actually experienced. Tom talked about his own students and his love of history and his plans to travel during summer break, and for 2 hours I was just a woman on a date instead of someone carrying guilt and secrets. We didn't make plans to see each other again, but we exchanged numbers, and driving home I felt lighter than I had in months, remembering that I was a person outside of all the trauma. Summer came into my bedroom that night after I'd put Gregory to bed, climbing onto my comforter and sitting cross-legged while she picked at a loose thread on the blanket. She asked me if I was happy, and the question caught me off guard because happiness felt like such a complicated concept now, in ways it hadn't before everything fell apart. I sat down next to her and tried to figure out how to answer honestly without burdening her with adult complexities. I told her I was content, and I was proud of our family, and I was hopeful about the future, which was true even if it wasn't the simple, uncomplicated happiness I'd had before Thanksgiving. Summer nodded and then said she was glad I wasn't sad anymore, and I realized with a shock that my children had been watching me more carefully than I'd understood, worrying about my emotional state while I'd been focused on managing logistics and guilt. I pulled her into a hug and promised her that I was okay, that we were all going to be okay, and she relaxed against me like she'd been holding tension I hadn't noticed. Blake's 1-year cardiac anniversary passed in late April, marking 12 months since his first heart attack in that ambulance. His cardiologist called me to give me an update since I was still listed as his emergency contact, telling me that Blake's heart function had stabilized at around 40% ejection fraction, and his prognosis was better than they'd initially expected. The doctor credited the assisted living facility's strict medication management during those critical first months, and Blake's current commitment to following medical advice, taking his pills on schedule, and attending all his follow-up appointments. Blake called me himself that evening to tell me the good news and to thank me again for arranging the assisted living placement when he'd needed it most. I told him I was glad he was doing well, and I meant it, even though the conversation was complicated by my knowledge of what I'd done before his heart attack, the bacon and donuts and deliberate enablement that had contributed to his collapse. He didn't mention any of that, and neither did I, and we talked for a few minutes about the kids' upcoming school events before hanging up. Sunday morning, I took Summer and Gregory to church, something we'd been doing more regularly since the divorce as a way to maintain routine and community. The sermon that day was about forgiveness and redemption, about how carrying anger and guilt prevents us from moving forward into the lives we're meant to live. Halfway through the service, I found myself crying unexpectedly, tears running down my face while the pastor talked about releasing the weight of our worst actions. Gregory noticed and whispered, asking if I was okay, and I told him yes, that sometimes grown-ups cry when they're thinking about important things. After the service ended, I lit a candle in the prayer alcove and knelt there for the first time in months, asking for forgiveness for what I'd done to Blake and strength to be a better person going forward. I didn't know if I believed in divine forgiveness, or if God was listening to someone who deliberately endangered her husband's life, but the ritual felt important anyway, a physical act of acknowledging my guilt and my desire to change. Greta called me the following Tuesday and asked if I wanted to meet for lunch, and we sat in a quiet corner booth at a sandwich shop near the hospital where I worked. She looked different somehow, calmer and more grounded, and she told me she'd been in therapy for the past 6 months processing her family dynamics and Marcia's manipulation. She said she'd realized how much damage her mother had done to all of them, teaching them that love meant control and sacrifice meant giving up your own needs entirely. Greta apologized for not speaking up at Thanksgiving when Blake announced the 401k change, said she'd been frozen by years of conditioning to never challenge Marcia's authority. She told me she admired how I'd fought back against Marcia's schemes, even though she hoped I hadn't sacrificed too much of myself in the process. I looked at her across the table and told her honestly that I had sacrificed parts of myself, that I'd crossed lines I never thought I'd cross and done things I wasn't proud of. We talked for over an hour about growing up with Marcia as a mother, about the patterns of manipulation that had shaped Blake's entire worldview, and we agreed to stay in touch as allies in surviving and recovering from Marcia's legacy. Blake called me a few weeks later asking if he could take Summer and Gregory on a weekend trip to visit his father, Jerry, who'd been largely absent from everything that had happened, but now wanted to reconnect with his grandchildren. I was surprised Jerry had reached out after staying silent through the divorce and Blake's health crisis, but I agreed to the trip and helped Blake plan an accessible itinerary that wouldn't overtax his physical limitations. They left on Friday afternoon and came back Sunday evening, and both kids were excited telling me about their weekend. Summer said Grandpa Jerry had apologized for not protecting them from Grandma Marcia's behavior, that he'd admitted he should have stood up to her years ago instead of just eating turkey and ignoring everything. Gregory said Jerry had taken them fishing and taught them how to bait hooks, and Blake had been able to participate even with his mobility limitations. I was glad Jerry was finally taking some responsibility, even if it was years too late, and I could see that healing was happening across the family in small ways, people acknowledging their failures and trying to do better. The nursing conference in June gave me a chance to present on patient advocacy and family dynamics in healthcare, drawing on my professional experience while privately thinking about my personal situation with Blake. I stood at the podium talking about how families navigate medical decisions and the importance of clear communication between providers and patients, and afterward several nurses approached me to share their own stories. One woman told me about her sister's husband who'd refused treatment because of religious beliefs, and how the family had struggled with respecting his autonomy while watching him deteriorate. Another nurse described her own divorce after her spouse prioritized his parents over their marriage, and how she'd had to rebuild her identity afterward. I realized that the skills I'd used to navigate Blake's cardiac crisis, the medical knowledge and strategic thinking, were valuable to others even if I wasn't proud of how I'd used them initially. The conference organizers offered me opportunities to teach workshops and mentor other nurses dealing with complex family situations, and I accepted, feeling like maybe I could turn my experience into something positive. Summer told me one evening while we were doing dishes together that she wanted to be a nurse like me when she grew up because she liked helping people who were sick. I felt both proud and concerned hearing this. Proud that she saw value in my work, but worried that she'd been shaped by watching me navigate our family crisis. I told her that nursing was a wonderful career, but she should explore all her options and not decide too young what she wanted to be. She dried a plate carefully and said she knew that, but she specifically wanted to help people who were sick like Daddy had been, people who needed someone to advocate for them and make sure they got proper care. I realized my children had learned both resilience and compassion from our family's struggles, that they'd watched me fight for their stability and Blake work to recover his health, and somehow they'd come through it with empathy and tact. It felt like a small redemption, knowing that Summer and Gregory had gained something positive from all the pain. Blake called me on a Thursday afternoon in late June, his voice heavy in a way that made my stomach drop before he even said why he was calling. Marcia had passed away in the memory care facility that morning, her dementia having progressed rapidly over the final months until she no longer recognized anyone or remembered her own schemes. Blake sounded sad, but also relieved, and he asked if I would come to the funeral for the kids' sake, knowing it would be awkward, but recognizing that some kind of closure was important. I agreed even though the thought of attending Marcia's funeral made me uncomfortable, and Saturday morning I put on a black dress and drove Summer and Gregory to the funeral home where Blake was waiting. The service was small and strange, maybe 20 people scattered in the chapel, most of them looking uncomfortable rather than genuinely grieving. I saw Uncle Ronald's widow sitting in the back row, and when our eyes met we exchanged a look of understanding, two women who'd survived Marcia's manipulation and lived to see her buried. The pastor gave a generic sermon about eternal rest and God's mercy, and Blake gave a short eulogy about his mother's strength and determination, without mentioning any of the damage she'd caused. Afterward at the reception, I stood with Blake and the kids while people offered condolences. And I was struck by how someone who'd affected so many lives so deeply had so few people mourning her genuinely, how her legacy was mostly relief and unresolved trauma rather than love. 3 weeks after the funeral, Blake called to schedule a meeting at his attorney's office. The estate had been settled, and he said there were things I needed to know about Marcia's finances. I drove to the office building downtown and found Blake sitting in the waiting room looking tired but calmer than I'd seen him in months. The attorney brought us into a conference room and spread out paperwork across the table, showing account statements and property deeds and insurance policies. Marcia had nearly $2 million in total assets that nobody except maybe her accountant knew about. She'd hidden savings accounts in 3 different banks, owned another rental property nobody knew existed, and had life insurance policies on both Jerry and Blake that would have paid out huge amounts. Blake was the primary beneficiary on everything since Jerry had died years ago, and Marcia had never updated her will after that. The attorney explained that Blake could take all of it, or he could distribute it however he wanted. Blake sat there looking at the numbers for a long time before he said he was setting up trusts for Summer and Gregory with most of the money. He kept only enough to cover his ongoing medical expenses and maybe a year of living costs. The attorney nodded and started drawing up trust documents while Blake told me he didn't want Marcia's money to corrupt him the way it had corrupted her and everyone she touched. He said Summer and Gregory deserved security, but he didn't want them to have access until they were old enough to understand where it came from and what it cost. I watched him sign the papers and saw that he'd actually learned something from everything that happened, that he understood now how money and manipulation had destroyed our family. I met with Ramona 2 days later at her office to review the trust arrangements Blake had set up. She looked over the documents and said it was smart planning that protected the kids' futures, without giving either Blake or me the ability to touch the funds. The trust wouldn't be accessible until Summer turned 25 and Gregory turned 23, and there were strict rules about what the money could be used for before that. Ramona asked how I was feeling about everything now that Marcia was gone and the estate was settled. I told her I was grateful for her help getting me through the divorce, but I was still working through guilt about what I'd done to Blake. She leaned back in her chair and said that family law had taught her that people were capable of both terrible and noble actions sometimes in the same situation. She said I shouldn't define myself by my worst moments because everyone made bad choices when they were hurt and scared. I asked if she thought I was a bad person, and she said she thought I was a person who'd been betrayed, and responded in ways I probably regretted, but that didn't make me evil. She reminded me that Blake had abandoned his family financially, and Marcia had manipulated people for decades, and that my response was understandable even if it wasn't right. I left her office feeling slightly less terrible about myself, but still aware that I'd crossed lines I couldn't uncross. Blake started dating someone he met through a cardiac support group, and after a few months he asked if she could meet Summer and Gregory. I agreed because the kids needed to see their father building a healthy life. He brought her to one of Summer's soccer games and introduced us briefly in the parking lot. Her name was Sarah, and she worked as a social worker specializing in chronic illness and family trauma. She shook my hand and told me she respected how I'd handled co-parenting under difficult circumstances. I didn't tell her the whole story about the life insurance policy or the bacon, or how I'd enabled Blake's decline. She seemed kind and patient with Blake, and when I watched her interact with the kids after the game, I could see they liked her. Summer told me later that Sarah was nice and didn't try too hard to be their friend. She just asked them questions about school and soccer and listened to their answers. Gregory said she brought good snacks. I was genuinely happy that Blake had found someone who understood his health issues and his complicated family history. She seemed good for him in ways I never was, and I hoped she could help him stay on track with his medications and his therapy. I'd been casually dating for a few months when I met Michael at a hospital fundraiser, where he was volunteering as a teacher helping set up the silent auction. We talked about our kids and our divorces and discovered we had a lot in common navigating co-parenting after difficult marriages. He had 2 kids from his previous marriage and understood the complications of blended families and shared custody schedules. We started seeing each other regularly, and after 3 months it felt serious enough that I needed to figure out what to tell him about my past. He knew Blake and I had divorced after Blake changed his beneficiaries to give everything to his mother, but he didn't know about the life insurance policy I'd taken out or my role in Blake's health crisis. My therapist said I needed to be honest with people I was building real relationships with, but that I didn't owe everyone my complete history right away. She said there was a difference between being honest and trauma dumping, and I needed to find the right time and way to share the harder parts of my story. I practiced what I might say to Michael, but every version sounded either too casual or too dramatic. I was working on finding the balance between honesty and self-protection, between sharing my truth and not scaring away someone good. 2 years after the divorce, Summer and Gregory were doing better than I'd hoped. Summer made the honor roll consistently, and joined the debate team where she channeled her anger into arguments about social justice and policy. She was less explosive at home and more confident at the school. Gregory stayed gentle and empathetic in ways that reminded me of who Blake used to be before Marcia's influence took over. He volunteered at an animal shelter and wanted to be a veterinarian. I watched them play in the backyard one Saturday afternoon, Summer teaching Gregory how to kick a soccer ball properly while they laughed and argued about technique. They had good relationships with both Blake and me, spending weekends with their father at his apartment and weekdays with me at the house. They'd adapted to the divorce better than I'd feared, and they seemed stable and happy despite everything they'd witnessed. I felt grateful that protecting their stability had been worth the complicated choices I'd made, even the ones I regretted. They were okay, and that mattered more than anything else. Blake invited me to his apartment one evening without the kids, saying he wanted to show me something he'd been working on. I drove over curious and slightly nervous about what he wanted. He opened the door looking healthier than he had in years, his color better and his energy higher. He led me to his small office where his laptop sat open on a desk covered with notebooks and printed pages. He'd been writing a memoir about his experience with family manipulation and cardiac illness. He said he wanted to help other people recognize unhealthy family dynamics before they caused the kind of damage Marcia had caused. He let me read a few chapters, and I was surprised by how honest he was about his mistakes and his mother's narcissism. He wrote about Thanksgiving and the 401k and the heart attacks and the divorce with clarity I hadn't expected. He asked if I was okay with him including our story, and I told him yes, as long as he was honest about his role and didn't make me into a villain. He promised to write it with compassion for everyone involved, including Marcia, trying to understand how she became the person she was rather than just condemning her. I saw that he'd found purpose in his suffering, that he was trying to turn his pain into something that might help other people avoid similar situations. The hospital promoted me to a director-level position overseeing nursing education and staff development. The salary increase was significant, and the work was challenging in ways I enjoyed. I sat in my new office looking out over the parking lot and realized I was thriving professionally in ways I never imagined during my marriage. The financial security I'd fought so hard for through the divorce mattered less now than the career satisfaction and personal growth I'd achieved. I thought about the life insurance policy I was still paying on Blake, the premiums now over $70,000 total. I wondered if I should let it lapse now that the kids had Marsha's trust funds securing their futures. But I decided to keep paying it as a safety net, and as a reminder of how far we'd all come from that Thanksgiving dinner. The policy felt like evidence of who I'd been at my worst, and who I was trying not to be anymore. On what would have been our 12th wedding anniversary, Blake texted asking if I wanted to meet for coffee without the kids. I agreed, and we sat in a cafe downtown on a Wednesday morning when neither of us had work obligations. He looked across the table at me and said he knew I'd enabled his self-destruction during the divorce. He said he knew about the bacon with extra salt, and the donuts left where he'd find them, and the way I'd supported Marsha's advice to avoid medication. He said he forgave me because he understood why I'd done it after what he'd done at Thanksgiving. I felt tears in my eyes as I told him I was sorry for crossing ethical lines, and I was glad he'd survived to be a father to our children. We agreed that we'd both made terrible choices that hurt each other and ourselves, but that we'd both grown into better people through facing the consequences. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was an honest one. We finished our coffee and hugged briefly in the parking lot before driving away in separate cars. We'd become friendly co-parents who shared a complicated history, but no longer shared the bitterness that had consumed us. I finally told Michael about the life insurance policy and my role in not protecting Blake from his self-destruction. We were sitting on my couch after the kids had gone to bed, and I just started talking, explaining everything from Thanksgiving through the heart attacks and the divorce. He was quiet for a long time after I finished, looking at his hands and processing what I'd said. Then he told me he appreciated my honesty even though it was hard to hear. He asked if I would make the same choices now, and I said no, that I'd learned revenge doesn't heal betrayal, and becoming like the people who hurt you is its own kind of defeat. He said everyone had parts of their past they weren't proud of, and what mattered was who we chose to be going forward. He asked if I was still that person who'd enabled Blake's decline, and I said I didn't think so. Therapy and time had changed how I responded to hurt. We kept dating after that conversation, and I felt hopeful about building something healthy and honest with someone who knew the worst parts of my history. Blake's book was published by a small press that specialized in memoirs about family trauma and mental health. It got modest attention, mostly positive reviews in online spaces where people discussed narcissistic parents and family manipulation. He did a few interviews on podcasts and local radio shows where he was honest about his mistakes and his mother's patterns. Several people reached out to thank him for giving them language to describe their own experiences with manipulative family members. Summer and Gregory were proud of their father for turning his pain into something helpful. I was proud of him too, seeing that he'd finally become the person he could have been without Marsha's influence, someone who used his experiences to help others, rather than just survive them. I attended Blake's book launch with Michael and the kids on a warm Saturday afternoon at a small bookstore downtown. The place was packed with about 50 people, mostly strangers who'd come because of the podcast interviews Blake had done about family manipulation and narcissistic parents. Summer and Gregory sat in the front row looking proud while Blake stood at a podium talking about how he'd almost destroyed his life by prioritizing his mother's demands over his own family. He looked healthy, standing without assistance, speaking clearly about the mistakes he'd made and the lessons he'd learned. When he finished reading from his book, he looked directly at me and thanked me publicly for being a good co-parent and for helping him survive when he was at his lowest point. The audience clapped, and I felt tears in my eyes because I knew the complete truth was more complicated than what Blake was saying. But I accepted his gratitude anyway because we'd both agreed to move forward rather than dwell on the darkest parts of our history. After the event, our two families went to dinner at an Italian restaurant nearby, and I sat there looking around the table at Blake and his girlfriend, Michael and me, and our 4 kids between us. We'd built something functional and even warm from the wreckage of what Marsha had destroyed, and while it wasn't the family I'd imagined at that Thanksgiving dinner, it was real, and it worked. 3 years had passed since Blake stood up with his champagne glass and announced he'd given his mother his retirement account. I was genuinely happy now in a way that felt different from the naive happiness I'd had before everything fell apart. My career as a hospital director gave me satisfaction and purpose beyond just paying bills. Michael knew about the life insurance policy and the bacon and all the ways I'd contributed to Blake's suffering, and he chose to be with me anyway. Summer and Gregory were resilient kids who'd learned that families could break and rebuild in new forms, and they had healthy relationships with both their parents. Blake and I co-parented better than we'd ever been married, talking regularly about the kids without the bitterness that had consumed us during the divorce. I still carried guilt about what I'd done during those 6 months when I'd enabled Blake's self-destruction, but I'd learned to live with moral complexity and to forgive myself for being human and flawed. The life insurance policy was still active, the premium still coming out of my account every month, a reminder of who I was at my worst, and a commitment to never be that person again. Blake's health was stable with proper medication and regular checkups. Marcia's money was sitting in trust funds securing our children's futures and their college educations. We'd all learned that family could be rebuilt after betrayal, that people could grow and change, and that sometimes the endings we get aren't the ones we imagined, but they're good enough. It wasn't the fairy tale I'd dreamed about on my wedding day, but it was real and earned and more than I thought possible when everything was falling apart.